I've Wonderful. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us early in the morning. I know many of you are used to an afternoon webinar, but I do think it's nice for a change to be fresh, and I'm sure that you're going to be as engaged as what most of you are in some of the other webinars that we're doing. We are very pleased to say that we are joined here by Dr. Coward today. He is the head of consulting at Peterberry Consultancy. And this is a real honor for us to be able to really hear from an absolute expert as to how we can make use of 360, that it really maximizes performance and development in general. So we want to thank you. We know that this is late in the afternoon for you, Sean, but we're really pleased to have you and excited to be learning from you. I don't think that there's anybody with as much experience as yourself in the realm of 360s, generally speaking, but also then specifically around using good quality 360s, and in this instance now with case studies around the Hogan 360 as well. So thank you for that. Just two quick notices for everybody joining. Please engage with us in the chat. Please ask your questions at any point in time throughout the presentation. We will be allocating some time at the end of this presentation for us to go through some of those questions. If we can't get to everything, we will be answering them afterwards as well, or directing them to Dr. Coward as well. There will be an email sent through afterwards with a quiz that you need to please complete if you are interested in CPD points. For those of you who are, please do so. And then also we will be sharing the recording, so you don't have to frantically take notes throughout the session as well. There will be some additional information shared with you as well, so it hopefully will feel like Christmas afterwards, but you can expect the mail to go through tomorrow morning. I think on that note, again, Dr. Coward, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Yanni, for a very complimentary and bubbly introduction, and thank you to all of your participants here today. I do understand it is quite early there in South Africa, and that you had a nice day off yesterday, a public holiday. So kudos to everybody who's made it along here today, and hopefully myself and Yanni can add value and make it worth your time for coming along. Purpose of getting together today is to introduce you to a tool that you may not be aware of, that you might find useful for some of your clients. We're going to be quite descriptive in terms of the tool, how it works, run through some case studies. I think ideas of in practice how this tool could be beneficial. And then maybe 15, 20 minutes at the end there, Yanni, for some questions. Feel free to post them in the chat, or I'll be more than happy to sort of deal with those face to face if people have questions. Now, very briefly, a little bit about myself and my company. I'm the head of consulting at this wonderful little family-owned business on the other side of the world from you, same hemisphere. I'm calling from Sydney, Australia today, and that's where Peterberry Consultancy was first established around about 30 years ago. So our main office is in Sydney, but we have a presence throughout Australia and also in New Zealand. And recently, we've gone global. We have a presence now in the Americas, and my colleague might be on the call today as well, Liron, from our new office in Ireland. So we'd like to think that with all of those touch points, we can deal with the different time zones and help out people with their 360 queries. But obviously we have the wonderful Yanni here and JVR, who are great partners we have a wonderful relationship with, who could obviously intermediate with any questions you have there as well. We have a lot of arms, different things to our business, much like JVR in South Africa. We are the Hogan distributors in Australasia. We are the co-authors of the Hogan 360 I'll take you through. We have a consulting arm. We have a coaching business. We have a couple of wonderful PhDs, very clever researchers in our business as well. So we use all of that, I guess, to provide value for our clients and come up with the optimal people-based solutions that we can. But today, as I said, we're here to talk about the Hogan 360, which PBC had a real role in developing alongside our colleagues at Hogan. So I thought in terms of a rough agenda to guide us through our hour today, keeping in mind we'll keep about 15 minutes aside at the end for questions, talking about multi-rater feedback generally. What is it? I'm sure you all have seen this in some form or another. Talk about the Hogan 360 more particularly, how it maybe differs from some of the other products in the market, what it looks like, what are some of the main value added features there. And then I'll step you through the Hogan report, very, very high level, just to get a sense of what you would get as a practitioner. On the other end in terms of the Hogan 360, get a sense of all the information you get there and how you might look to integrate that. Then Yanni really prompted me to try and make this practical and tell a few stories around a few case studies. So I've got one which is more one-on-one coaching type based a case study, and then one much briefer, although I can go into more detail in the question time around how we might use a tool like this organizationally. We'll wrap up with some administration stuff, best practice, how you might get certified, and then we can jump into question time. So the value of multi-rater feedback, generally speaking, I'm sure the idea of 360s isn't new to anybody here. Certainly our founder, Peter Berry, 30 years ago, having used the Hogan personality assessments for a little while, thought that there was a gap in the market in terms of providing a rigorous 360 tool. The basic idea of multi-rater feedback is going out to a bunch of people who you know and getting them to tell you what they think about you, right? Protecting them with anonymity is ideal via some sort of online survey. And the 360 idea is really the notion that we want to seek feedback from people around the organizational hierarchy, right? There's one thing asking our bosses, but if I manage up well, that feedback might always be glowing. So why not also ask my direct reports? Why not also ask my peers like Liron here what they think of working with me? And that 360-degree feedback provides that real balance in terms of my reputation and how I'm seen in the workplace. The real value of multi-rater feedback is that you can have blind spots surfaced. There's this idea of, I think I present in this particular way. I know what my intentions and values are, but Liron in a 360 might tell me that that's landing in a completely different way. So that's the real value of multi-rater feedback. There's very much a focus with 360s into our reputation, those behaviors that we all choose in any given moment, day to day. There's interesting correlations between that and personality. And obviously, Yanni here is an expert in the Hogan personality suite. They work very well together. But with a 360, these people don't necessarily know me, what makes me tick. They can mention my behavior. They can mention my reputation. They can talk about what they see day to day. And that's what we're measuring with a 360. Now, because it's based on personality, rather than more intrinsic qualities, things like personality or even cognitive ability, we can change how we're perceived by others. I can choose my behaviors at any given point. So we do say that 360s are a snapshot in time. And this is worth emphasizing perhaps to your clients if they get a somewhat challenging 360 feedback report that, look, this is at this point in time, September 2025, let's come back in a year's time, make some real conscious efforts to change these behaviors, and our reputation will shift along with that. So many different ways you can use a 360 tool. That first one there, transitioning from manager to leader, I find is a really useful case if you do have these sort of clients from a coaching perspective, or if you're managing people making that transition. For these people, what does the book say? What got you here won't necessarily get you there. They will repeat the same behaviors that were successful for them as individual contributors quite naturally. But as we know, going into leadership, different behaviors are required. Sometimes it takes actually hearing that from our colleagues via 360 for the penny to drop. And I can give you many interesting examples of that. There's other examples where we might use 360s in terms of gauging performance, understanding who our high performers are. Maybe that's linked to restructuring organizations. It might be linked to some dysfunctional behavior. We are seeing it, for instance, executive levels. Indeed, 360s, I think it's fair to say, have historically been associated with underperformance and maybe even performance managing of individuals. And it's taken quite a while, I think, for us to shake that. Certainly now, Liron, I'm sure you would agree, we get certain clients who wonder why on earth they're doing a 360. What's behind this? Is my boss unhappy with me? Is this an attempt to manage me out? I think that remedial focus of 360s has been replaced long ago. I could pretty safely say that 95% at least of my Hogan 360s now are pure development. It's really a gift to leaders to get that feedback in terms of how they're doing. And it's not usually linked to any sort of performance metrics. Indeed, the report itself is often confidential and just used by the client. Every now and then we still get the remedial ones coming through, and they can be useful for that kind of thing. Other objectives that your clients or you might have, things like talent management, succession planning, another piece of data to put into all of those wonderful metrics you've got on your people in terms of understanding where their competencies lie, where they currently perform well, maybe from a coaching or L&D perspective, where we're looking to grow those individuals. So it can be laddered up from the individual to the organization and back down very easily, particularly the Hogan 360, the way it's structured. The 360 market is continuing to grow. This data is relatively old, as you can see. I'm sure in the last 9 years, we would see that sort of penetration rate even higher than 85%. Certainly, we're seeing it in Australia. Maybe during question time, Liron can talk about the trends that he's been seeing in Europe. Certainly, there's been an interesting recent development in Australia. I'm not sure whether this has been either broached or introduced in South Africa at all, but our federal government employees now, leadership of a certain level, are mandated to do 360s. It's part of regulation now. So this idea of the value of getting multi-rater feedback to give our leaders a sense of how they're traveling is something that's really taken hold in Australia and I believe other markets as well. So let's talk about the Hogan 360 in particular, maybe what makes it a little bit different from some of the other tools out there. And I think, look, as long as we're embracing feedback and we have some sort of 360 mechanism, those organizations can certainly benefit from it. But here's some points of difference, I guess. And we've done a lot of market research to understand other products out there. We think we can talk about the real value differentiators of the Hogan 360 in these four ways. Firstly, Hogan, as a brand, if you're familiar with them in terms of psychometrics, wouldn't put their name against a tool unless it had ticked all the boxes in terms of methodological rigor, validity, and reliability tests. And we do have a research team who's qualified to do that sort of apply that methodological rigor in terms of the development of the tool. And we've got a technical manual which we'll stand behind. I believe we've even provided Yanni's team with a copy of that. So you're more than welcome to browse that, those of you who are really interested in those sort of numbers. And I would say if you're looking at using a 360 tool and whether Hogan is one in the mix or not, do ask whether a technical manual is available because, you know, that we really should be able to stand behind our tools in terms of reliability and reliability and validity, I should say. There's a model, a framework anchoring the Hogan 360, which you don't always get in 360s, generally speaking. Those of you familiar with the Hogan personality tools are aware of socioanalytic theory, for instance, and the idea of getting along and getting ahead. Those sort of anchor points that allow us to understand and frame the data. We get the same thing with the Hogan 360, which I think a lot of clients find really useful in terms of, once again, laddering up and laddering down the insights to tell a story. The benchmarking is something the Hogan 360 does, which not many other 360s do, I believe. And quite often I get clients who look at the feedback and say, well, Sean, where does this position me? Maybe they're people who score high on competitiveness, but they really want to know relative to other leaders, how am I tracking? So we are able to provide that with a benchmark based on a really large sample, 40-odd thousand leaders and growing at last count there, to be able to give people a sense of how they're tracking. We can do segmented benchmarks there. If you've got a particular industry of interest or even an employee level of interest, we can segment that benchmarking group. And first and finally, and I think this is a really important point to make, Peter Berry, when he was co-authoring the 360, really wanted to develop a practical tool that at the end of an hour or maybe a 90-minute session, someone has a real strong sense of what they can do with this information and how they can move forward. And there's plenty of opportunities within the Hogan 360 to really understand what the practical implications are and get a real sense for that individual, what their strengths and opportunities are in terms of behaviors that they're currently displaying. Here's the leadership model that I mentioned earlier. It's a fairly simple framework, but one that's been validated and one that we're constantly testing against other frameworks we're seeing in the market. And it's also been informed by our colleagues over there at Hogan. It's a fairly simple model that's not going to completely bamboozle your clients. 4 quadrants in total. Really, the first 2 quadrants are a pretty good proxy for emotional intelligence. Self-management. How well do I regulate my emotions and my behaviors in terms of integrity and resilience? Relationship management, that more external side of emotional intelligence, reading other people, managing relationships with other people, influencing other people, soft skills, for instance. Now, down the bottom there, we essentially have business competence, working in the business, my work ethic, my organizational ability, my focus and my capability to deliver great results. Focusing on my portfolio, for instance, is where we see high scorers there. And finally, working on the business. Forgetting about your own vertical for a moment, thinking about the business more holistically and in a more future-oriented way in terms of strategy, innovation, culture. Those higher leadership competencies sit in the fourth competency. And because the Hogan 360 has so many quantitative elements, we can feed the numerical data into each of those quadrants and each of those sub-themes to give a sense of how people are tracking in terms of their own leadership profile. In terms of the practicalities, we're looking at around about 20 minutes for people to complete a survey, and we're looking at maybe say 12 to 15 odd raters is usually a pretty good number for a sample size. We've got multiple languages on offer, and we're constantly adding to these languages all the time. The reporting is instantaneous. As soon as the data has been collected, the reporting has been available, and we can get a QA'd report across very quickly, usually within 24 to 48 hours. All assessment is done online now, including a phone-based version. So accessibility for the assessments is really quite straightforward. I've already just touched on the methodological rigor and the fact that we have a freely available technical manual for those people who are interested. Our research team is constantly scrutinizing our benchmarks, updating those, and going back to that data once again. Is this thing measuring the things that we think are important? And is the model internally consistent? So for those of you who have that more methodological bent, all of the information you'll find is in our technical manual there. What about the report that you get at the end of this? 12 to 15 odd people have all submitted their data. You're left with a approximately 40-page report, maybe a little bit more if you choose to add some customization features. There's a lot of data in the Hogan 360. And if you're familiar with Hogan products generally, you're aware that the devil's in the detail. There's often a lot of granularity in these reports, but the report is structured in a really clever way that allows for us to try and identify key themes. Now, that's done by, in a way, redundancy, asking the same sort of items across different areas of the report, making sure that we're not being influenced by outliers in the report, right? That we are getting consistent themes by multiple people by asking questions in similar type ways. There's really 3 buckets of information in the Hogan 360. There are a bunch of 50 standard survey items, which we psychologists love to rank using our Likert scales. We've got a 7-point Likert scale that's very balanced. That gives us the quantitative data we're after. We then have a section of the report that's really powerful. Based on having this tool in play for over a decade now, we collected a lot of qualitative information. Our researchers did a thematic analysis, and we landed on 30 top strengths and opportunities that people usually mention in 360s. Now we give people 4 votes and ask them to go and vote for Yanni's top 4 strengths and top 4 opportunities. We're washing those insights against what we've already learned from the Likert scale items, right? Seeing if anything else pops out, seeing if there's enough consistency that we can say with our client with confidence that these appear to be really consistent themes with your raters. And then at the end, we open things up, open text box, right? We really value in our own world, what does Liron think of my strengths, opportunities, and possibly even my overused strengths? So 3 buckets of information, we triangulate, draw out those consistent themes, and then end with a development plan. Have a conversation about what do you take out of this, a bit of a keep, start, stop stop, to give that person something concrete to leave the conversation with there. We can get feedback from many different types of rater groups. Obviously, a manager, a line manager is a really important one to have. That's the one person or one grouping that we don't protect via anonymity. We think it's important that the manager ratings stand out on their own. But other than that, you can choose peers, stakeholders, direct reports if they're there. Make sure that we're getting that really well-rounded piece of 360 degree feedback. And as I said, the benchmarking is really robust here. 40,000 and climbing is sort of how many data points we have now, over 1 million raters. So we're really comfortable in our benchmarking. And because of its size, we can update that by all those splits that we mentioned earlier. Now, I've just pulled out a few key pages here, not to overwhelm you with detail, but to give you a sense of the sort of information that you get with a Hogan 360. There's a bit of a landing page on the left there for our Maria here. This gives us a few pieces of information. This is all based on the 50 standard items ranked on the 7-point Likert scale that I mentioned earlier. You can see there the descriptors at each of those levels of the 7-point scale, quite well balanced. 1 doesn't describe Sean at all. 7 describes Sean exactly, and 4 describes Sean somewhat. So we can see there's balance there. There's actually nothing too deprecating in getting a 4 according to that level. But above that, if we want to understand relative scoring, we have our benchmarking table. And we know that the median of our benchmarking group doesn't sit at 4. It sits closer to 5.7. This is important to point out to people, the skew in this distribution that shows that there's a lot of high-performing leaders out there. So we can use both of those data points together to understand absolute and relative scoring. We can get a sense of how many raters are involved there, 13 in Maria's case. Maria does rate herself in the Hogan 360, but we don't include those scores in this overall rating. We don't want it to be contaminated by someone, for instance, with imposter syndrome, or maybe a little bit of sense of grandiosity. We want it to be those other raters there. And then, as I mentioned before, we can cascade all of that numerical data down into the leadership framework to get a sense of what someone's profile looks like. Next step is to go to the 50 standard items and get a sense of what are we seeing here in terms of key themes. Now, 50 is a lot. There's 2 pages of these, right? But we have cleverly organized this page such that it's rank ordered. What we could do is just look at, say, the top 10 items at the top of page 4 and the bottom 10 items at the bottom of page 5. This is our standard practice to get a sense of what those key themes are in terms of strengths and opportunities. And for each of these items, we can see Maria's score and the benchmark score. This is really useful. An item like hard work, work ethic, for instance, has a really high benchmark. It's difficult to stand out by working hard at the leadership level. I'm sure the coaches in the audience would agree. But there's some other items here, maybe around the soft skills or being strategic, where the benchmark is much lower. And you could emphasize to your client, wow, you have a bit of a superpower here, a really unusual strength that might be your competitive advantage in terms of your leadership profile. So that's an example of how the benchmarking can be used to really deliver additional value to your client. You can see there in the final page how we fed those scores through to the 4 quadrants there, and you can have a conversation around what we're seeing there in terms of relative strengths. Moving on, we can go into real diagnosis mode. There is a dedicated page to each one of those 4 quadrants where we can see not only the individual items again with this item score, but where all of those scores came from in terms of the various rater groups. We can see for the first time here now the self-scores to see if people are either over or underestimating their own competence, and then get a sense of which group might have driven those scores up or down. For instance, if I get a lower score, is everybody agreeing that I have zero empathy? Or is it just one particular group who I happen to be really tough with, a peer group, for instance? We can develop an action plan based on that more granular detail. So basically, the Hogan 360 gives you enough detail to really go as deep, or I guess at higher level, as you like to. We then move into the second phase of the report, which is based on that methodology I shared with you earlier, right? 30 top strengths, 30 top opportunities that usually come up. People, all the raters, are given 4 votes and 4 votes to cast in terms of what they think my strengths and my opportunities are. Those votes are differentially weighted. My number one vote attracts 4 points. Number two vote attracts 3 points, etc. And what we do is tally up all those weighted scores. And, usually if you look at the top half dozen items, or maybe the ones that hit double digits, that's giving a sense of what those key strengths and opportunities are coming through in a different format to wash against what we've already learned about that individual. And again, benchmarking is really valuable here. We can see for Maria, for instance, that some of her scores are right in line with the benchmark, such as being a positive role model. But things like being positive and enthusiastic, Maria is way ahead of where this usually ranks in our database. Bit of a superpower, a bit of competitive advantage in leaning into those ones. We can do the same on the opportunities. What are common opportunities versus those opportunities we don't see quite as much? It gives the individual a bit of an insight into their own behaviors and how common or uncommon they are. Now, finally, and I think this for many clients is their favorite part of the report, or maybe not, depending on the feedback, is hearing from people in their own words what they actually think, right? This ties it all together. If we're wondering, for instance, about the nuance around a suggestion to communicate better, it'll usually come out in the written comments, and we're able to add that nuance to the overall strengths and opportunities. Again, split out by raters so we can get a sense without violating anyone's confidentiality, roughly what group thinks what of me in terms of strengths, opportunities, and that classic Hogan question of overused strengths. We basically ask that. What's the strength of Yanni's that she might overuse on some occasions? And people are really good at identifying that. The really driven leader who perhaps isn't as empathetic as they could be, or the super empathetic leader who doesn't lean into conflict as much as they might. So with all of that information together, hopefully you got at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end to do a basic keep, stop, start development plan with your client. Ask them in their own words, in terms of this feedback, what really resonated with you? What strengths came out of this report for you? Behaviors that you want to keep doing, right? Because we want to leverage the good stuff just as much as working on the development opportunities. What things did you hear from your colleagues that you're not doing enough of? They want to see more of. We're going to call that our start category. And finally, what am I doing too much of? Particularly if I'm that new leader who still wants to be across all the detail, maybe I need to step back and coach a little bit more. So landing on a few of these very practical examples, particularly at the beginning of a coaching engagement, you might have follow-up sessions, but at least wrapping up this initial session with the client's own thoughts in terms of what they think they could work on is really valuable and just gives them something practical to leave the session with. There's appendices in here as well if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. If you want to diagnose whether all of my direct reports think I need to get better at delivering difficult feedback, or whether it's just some of them, the appendices will tell you that. They'll give you a sense of how many of my direct reports gave me a 1 versus a 7, for instance. That average of 4 might hide that variability. So feel free to go fishing around in the appendices as well and see if you can add a little bit more nuance for your clients. Now, let's talk about a case study. How would you use this in practice? And we've got a number of these lying around, and some of them are my own clients. I chose one deliberately that wasn't my own client. Sometimes, by my experience, I can end up coloring outside the lines a little bit when it's my own client. So I'm talking about a client from our head of coaching, Lee Wallace, had this client around sort of 6 months ago. And we chose this one also because we thought it's quite useful to show the value that a 360 can give over and above, say, using basic psychometrics, which I'm a huge fan of. I absolutely love personality. Yanni knows this. We were talking about this earlier. But I think in this case study, hopefully I'll demonstrate where a Hogan 360 or even any 360 can add value. And, in maybe a 6-session coaching engagement you might have with your clients, how it might accelerate getting to those key opportunities more quickly than if you had a more traditional conversational start or perhaps started with some psychometrics. So let's meet Sarah, one of Lee's clients, classic engineering profile. You've coached a lot of engineers, probably have a sense of maybe some of those personality traits we see more often than not. Sarah currently has 6 direct reports, has been managing them for about 5 years. Sarah had moved up the chain very quickly, apparently, according to Lee, had been applauded for her work ethic, great attention to detail, real focus on results, that sort of mindset that we often see in engineering pioneering people. When it came to leadership, the manager did nominate Sarah for a leadership program, a bit of coaching, and as part of that, did some personality assessments and a Hogan 360, 6 sessions in total. Now, Sarah started by telling Lee, look, main challenges that she was experiencing was some difficulty with relationships and not being quite clear about how to take their career forward. So we'll keep those two objectives in mind as we move through. Now, I'm not here to plug the Hogan personality assessments. I'll let Yanni do that, but we do think it's useful. Other personality assessments can give us that same amount of insight, right? We're trying to understand temperamental preferences or values with our people. And if you've done coaching in the past with some good psychometrics to start with, we all know that can accelerate the process in terms of understanding what people care about, what they value, what their happy place is, what their preferred behaviors are. And that's wonderful. And if we were looking at this, Yanni, giving it a quick eyeball in terms of what we might see with Sarah, we can see some interesting things just jumping out. Again, you don't need to be Hogan certified. We just give you a sense of some of the things we might see. For instance, I'd be wondering with Sarah, how strategic is Sarah? Because she's high on inquisitive, but low on imaginative. Really interested to see how that plays out if we were to ask her colleagues. What else? Lower interpersonal sensitivity, lower altruism, bit of a classic engineer sort of profile there, very direct when it comes to communication and not necessarily the softest, warmest, cuddliest person in the place. How does that come across in terms of leadership there? The prudence is sort of mid-range. Subscales suggest someone with very high standards, and then we double down with the really high diligent. So this feedback that Sarah's had in the past in terms of being very diligent, very detail oriented is probably coming through there. I think I just got a question there about showing one page at a time. Unfortunately, I just have the slide with two here. Happy to share the sample flash later on if you find it useful. But I guess just at this stage, we're getting a sense of what hypotheses we might generate based on the personality profile. Now, according to Lee, that first session with the Hogans went down great. Sarah just went, yep, sounds like me, sounds like me. So the second session, Lee said, okay, let's test these hypotheses. Those of you who know Hogan's pride themselves on the fact that it's a really good predictor of how people see us, but it's an algorithm. It's based on probability. Let's go to Sarah's actual colleagues, see how much of these personality preferences are transferring their way through to chosen behaviors. That's where the 360 comes in. So I've just got a few key slides here in terms of understanding Sarah's overall results. So we remember 7-point Likert scale, okay. We remember you got to hit 5.7, just hit the median point of our benchmarking here. So a score of 5.8 sounds pretty good. It's kind of halfway between the 50th and 75th percentile. Sarah, as a relatively new manager, seems to be doing pretty well. Good number of raters there, 16, doesn't include Sarah's own rating, so we're pretty happy there. And then we go to the Hogan 360 model here and say, what are we seeing? Really high score in terms of working in the business. What is that? Work ethic, organization, delivering great results. Kind of consistent with what we saw in the personality profile. The 5.9 in relationship management surprised me a little bit. Slightly more introverted profile. In many ways, and with that more direct way of communicating to people. So really, really doing something interesting there. We certainly want to unpack that. Self-management was a little bit lower. There might be a suggestive, a little bit of edge, a little bit of stress and frustration occasionally. Wasn't really apparent in the personality profile. So what's going on there? Why are people picking that up? And working on the business, why is that a bit lower? Are we not spending enough time on strategy or culture, for instance? So we're generating some hypotheses here around Sarah. And then we go to that list of 50 items I mentioned before. Here we have the top half of that list for Sarah. Now, what do we see? There's a lot of data here. We don't want to just run through this in a laundry list type way. I always do a bit of a thematic analysis, right? So we got some light greens here. And I'm thinking, you know what? The light greens are what I would have expected from Sarah based on the personality, very holding people accountable, not afraid of difficult conversations, setting high expectations. Again, that lower interpersonal sensitivity, lower altruism, holding people accountable, challenging poor performance. Look on all these green items, how far above the benchmark Sarah is, because most leaders aren't good with that sort of thing. So she's got a real superpower there, a real point of difference from other leaders. What else is she good at? The light blue suggests she's She's prudent. She's highly diligent, right? Organizes things, great work ethic, really, really good at managing time. That kind of thing is really coming through here, which is consistent with what we would have expected. And otherwise, we're seeing the fact that she's a bit of a subject matter expert, great industry experience and knowledge and ability, which personality can't tell, but it probably leans into that prudence, that diligence, right? People knowing what's right. Now, these items down here still score very high, not necessarily apparently in personality results, right? And even if you didn't have personality results, if you'd asked Sarah to describe herself and what she thinks she's good at, I'd be surprised if Sarah picked out things like this. The fact that she makes people feel valued with that lower altruism, lower interpersonal sensitivity, very interesting. The fact that she's a good influencer, we didn't see a lot of high influencing evidence in the personality survey. So well done there. Has she built that capability? Is that something she's really worked on, building that muscle? Assertiveness and confidence is right up there as well as collaboration for a more introverted person. So we saw those relationship management scores a bit higher, maybe not natural strengths, maybe built habitual muscle there. What about at the bottom end? We see some lower scoring items here. None of them are really low. I'd say once you're still averaging 5, you're not in desperate straits, but we are below the benchmark on a number of these items. And again, if I was to theme them, would they be consistent with what we think we know about Sarah? There's a couple of items here, this mucky sort of yellow color, probably cultural items, I would say, morale and creating that positive working environment. I'm not too surprised based on Sarah's profile. What else? Even these sort of purpley items around soft skills and being that real relationship type person, never being rude or abrasive, they're a bit lower as well, which are consistent with the profile. Focusing on things like long-term stretch goals and new opportunities are coming up here. Was that the lower imaginative we saw, even though she's high on inquisitive, right? Interesting one. Unlocked potential, perhaps, in that regard. And then we see these red ones. The fact that Sarah seems to be a bit edgy. There's a threshold for frustration where other people start to pick that up. I mean, her adjustment score wasn't that low, actually. So, an interesting one. What is the thing that inflames Sarah here? What might be that trigger that shows a frustration that maybe she's not naturally prone to? Then we go to the ranking tables, top strengths, top opportunities. Where did most of the scores go on strengths? Actually, Sarah thinks that people think that Sarah's a pretty good leader. 5 years in, she's doing, in many ways, her personality profile isn't your classic sort of charismatic leader type, but that's certainly impacting some people, impressing some people. The subject matter expertise is coming through again here. The fact that she's good at planning with that diligence, not too surprising. The fact that she has this superpower of challenging poor performance, which usually ranks towards the bottom of our list of strengths, is that lower altruism and lower interpersonal sensitivity coming through, achieving results, driving really hard, getting stuff done. This seems to be Sarah's real gift and leadership profile so far. Now, if we hold a gun to people's heads, ask them to spend their votes on the list of opportunities, where do they decide to spend them? We've already had a sense of what Sarah might work on. What else do we see here? Yes, we see a confirmation that the interpersonal skills and the focus on morale could be a little bit stronger. We've seen some more validation of the idea that people want Sarah to be a little bit more strategic, a little bit more big picture, for instance. And maybe that's because they want Sarah to stop trying to do so much and maybe delegate a little bit more to create that space. So that's that amazing diligent sort of work ethic coming through and perhaps being overplayed by this person who was previously been an outstanding individual contributor. And then we see this item here around being less emotional and frustrated. It doesn't come up too often, so Sarah's got to be careful here. This is an opportunity that she probably needs to get on top of. Now we wash this against our wonderful, rich written commentary. And I believe there'll be a sample report we can share with you as well, where you'll get all of this data for Sarah yourself. I've just pulled out a few key phrases here and highlighted ones that probably capture the feedback overall. In their own words, people love the fact that Sarah is a technical expert, super hardworking, can do, gets things done, really organized, not afraid of confrontation. She's one of those leaders who'll lead in that regard, and really good at planning and execution. What do people think she could work on? Again, her own words. These are often very impactful for the client to actually hear people say this. Now, we said that there's some sort of suggestion that Sarah can get frustrated. And people here are sort of seeing a little bit of that, a lack of patience when people aren't really focused on results. She probably needs to delegate more, right? She's definitely overworked. And the soft skills, we could work on those a little bit. Now, what about those strengths that get overplayed? And this can be really interesting. What do people say in their own words in classic sort of Hogan language? Well, she's super diligent, probably micromanages a little bit, needs to step back. She's loyal and passionate about what she does. Now, that might be the trigger for other people who don't share those values. That can be the source of irritation. So it's not that neuroticism that we might naturally sort of go to as a smoking gun. It's value clashes that really seem to fire up Sarah a little bit. So we need to delegate a little bit more. And certainly this direct nature sometimes can rub people the wrong way. Now, armed with all of this information as a coach, I'm thinking from a personality perspective, I've got a sense of temperamental strengths and opportunities. But with the 360 data, we have even richer data in terms of some behaviors, strengths that have been built, or development opportunities that have been adopted because of the particular context that Sarah might need to work on. And I don't know about you, but I'm dealing those two things in a slightly different way. If people have temperamental strengths and opportunities, we're fighting against, personality to a certain extent here. Doesn't mean we can't change the behaviors, but there'll be some resistance. If we've adopted behaviors as a strength, it means I need to keep it up because it doesn't come natural. Don't be complacent. As an opportunity, I should be able to overwrite that a little bit more easily than necessarily if something is personality related. So just a little update, since we all know Sarah so well now. Lee has continued the coaching program. Sarah's really acknowledged that these interpersonal issues that she was having, that she nominated up front, were at least in part by the fact that she is so direct and she does show a little bit of frustration on occasion. She even took the opportunity to reach out to some of these peers and some of these colleagues she was having issues with and sort of offered an olive branch and said, look, this is my way. I'm really learning to understand myself a little bit more. And those people have graciously come back and said, no worries, thanks for reaching out. So there've been some great progress made with Sarah. And I think certainly leaning into this data because it came directly from the colleagues probably helped Sarah really own some of these behaviors. Now, I'll talk very quickly about how we might use the same sort of Hogan 360 at an organizational level. And I'll be really brief because I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions here. But we do have a large multinational company within the sort of petrochemical industry. PBC's been working with for a really long time, 10 years plus. They approached Peter himself a long time ago to say, look, we do have a 360 internally. We don't think it's really doing the job. It's not really robust or reliable. And we have a whole bunch of hypotheses we want to test as well. They're quite a scientific organization. They want to test things like how much does leadership impact engagement? How much does engagement then impact team performance and the company's bottom line and metrics that were really important to this company, such as safety? So, we had all of these hypotheses and questions there with which to develop a 360 that was specifically designed for this particular client. So rather than just rolling out a standard 360, we tailored it. We got a competency framework from this client. What does it take to be successful at this particular organization? And we tailored a bunch of items, mapped them against this competency framework, added in additional items to make sure we'd really covered that framework. And then once we'd sort of built that and they'd communicated that internally, we started rolling it out. And because of the quantitative nature of the 360, we were able to answer some of their questions, right? How much is, for instance, 360 performance in terms of measuring leaders' ability related to engagement? The stats, which they came back with themselves, their data scientists did this sort of thing. They think that 360 results accounted for about 50% of the differences in team engagement, which was fascinating data and validation to have. Moreover, they did a really interesting and maybe slightly mischievous experiment where they took some of their lower performing leaders and put them into high performing teams and swapped things around. And what they found is And perhaps as predicted, putting those lower performing leaders into a high performing team drag the whole performance of that team down. Whereas you put that high performing leader into the low performing team, all of a sudden their safety, engagement, and productivity results shot up. So some wonderful data from working with this client. They decided that the 50th percentile wasn't good enough for them. They've set internal benchmarks. They want their leaders to hit the 75th percentile. And they're quite concrete now in terms of using that numerical data and that benchmarking data to understand what good looks like at that particular organization. So still being used individually, but amazingly powerful to use this data at an organizational level. Finally, very quickly, just a few sort of housekeeping and administrative tips. I'm sure you can go to Yanni just to get more detail in terms of if you want to move forward, know more about the tool, a little bit about best practice administration. If you're thinking about rolling out something like this, I would say from experience, make sure you've got executive sponsorship. These things can be slightly threatening when you roll them out within organizations. Having a leader stand up and champion why we're doing this, maybe even having gone through it themselves and speaking from experience can just do wonders. Because, you know, in the end, we need people to buy into this. We want them to come along to the debriefs with an open mind, and we want people to spend 20 minutes of their time filling in the surveys. So getting that buy-in up front, being really clear about confidentiality, I think, is something that we should emphasize up front. How is this going to be used? Is the HR department going to keep all of the reports and maybe track that data? If so, fine. We need to communicate that to the people so they know, so they're not surprised later. But otherwise, if we can go into those debriefs or those coaching conversations and be able to reassure Liron, for instance, that nobody else sees the report unless Liron chooses to share it with a leader, you do find these people relax into the session. They realize now it's a development gift rather than a performance management tool. It can be used in multiple ways, but there's just a few thoughts there in terms of best practice. In terms of coaching, you know how to sort of set up best practice expectations there, what we're looking to achieve over the links, over the various sessions. Causal links in terms of data can be really powerful. If you're dealing with a leader, have their Hogan 360, maybe their personality. Why not also ask for the engagement data for their team? If you can see very consistent themes throughout these data sources, it can be really impactful. In terms of data privacy, if you have any concerns there, we understand that 360 data is probably the most sensitive data you can have on people. We scoured the world for the system that reassured us the most globally that it had just achieved all the best standards. And it's a Qualtrics platform, which we use now. And we're super confident that data there is really secure. Also within the 360 itself, you know, aside from the individual themselves, there are no names used. So we're protecting that. We can even anonymize the name of clients. If you have a really security conscious client, you know, it could be number 146 rather than Yanni, for instance. We could do all of that to really make sure your people feel comfortable. And we can do the tailoring and the customization thing. If you do have a client who feels that they're a bit of a snowflake, a really special organization, and leadership here looks very different, talk to us. We can customize and build a 360 around a particular framework to really help you out in that regard. Now, if all of this sounds good and you're thinking, how would I go about being able to use one of these tools? Firstly, I would say there is a certification process. Yanni and I were talking about this a week ago. It's kind of funny, you know, we don't have, a basement level in terms of a professional standard, and yet the data here from a 360 is so sensitive and the sessions can be so personal. We do want you to go through the certification just so you get those tips and tricks and best practice. A couple of ways of doing that. Jump online, do the online certification, about an hour. It's free. Yanni's team can give you the details there. Or if there's enough people in your environment there, Yanni, maybe I could come along and do a session at about this time with coffees and walk people through it, and we could even do some interactive type things. And the same principles apply. People will then feel comfortable using the tool. Now, Yanni just sort of mentioned that it's going to feel like Christmas. There will be an email shot out later on with a whole bunch of our white papers. We've got a research team who can't help themselves, constantly crunching the numbers to understand what good leadership looks like, as well as the technical manual, I believe. But for now, I think you've heard enough of me, Yanni. What do you think? Have we got some questions there, perhaps?
Absolutely. I dotted down quite a number of questions, and I do urge if there's anybody else who's got a burning question, either add it to the chat or unmute yourself. But I absolutely agree with you that there's so much value and there's so much information that you shared with us. The recording being made available to all of you afterwards so that you can actually go into the detail. I think that what stands out for me throughout the presentation is the quality of data that is generated by the use of this 360. I think many of us can go to the internet or make up some our own items and questions and pull together some sort of format that we think would be valuable, but it's not built on a scientific model. It's not validated. It's not compared to other leaders because often without that contextual information, meaning, a 5.7 being average on certain items versus certain other items being often scored lower on, like strategic thinking, Sean, to your example, does color in exactly what you need to discuss with this leader. So brilliant, Sean. I think the Hogan 360 is one of a kind. I do have a few questions, if you don't mind. The first thing that I want to ask you is, you guys often go into organizations with a development plan using the Hogan assessments and then the 360. My first question is, what have you found to be the absolute ideal intervention or timeline or sessions required for actual behavior change to take place? So when you
Yeah.
assess with 360, what's your typical intervention timelines prior to a reassessment or then intervention that you actually follow with to ensure that it's not only assessment data sharing and then it's hands off, that there's actual change happen, that the change happens?
What an excellent question, Yanni. And I'd be interested in your thoughts or any of your clients. Certainly, when we get asked what we would recommend in terms of best practice for an intervention around sustainable behavioral change, and that's what we're talking about here, we usually propose 6 sessions. Right about a month apart. So we're talking about a 6-month engagement there. And some of the research I've read about building of new habits and behavioral change does suggest that it takes about that much concentrated effort to shift the dial on some of these behaviors. Even things like picking up running and other habits, they have a similar sort of timeline. That also gives us enough time, and maybe JVR is the same as PBC here. We love our data. We want to anchor our coaching against some objective data, some fact there. We love starting with the personality. That gives me a sense of what drives people, MVPI, what language am I going to use? What goals can we keep anchoring against for behavioral change before we talk about habitual, behaviors or interpersonal strategies. Then the second session, we do the Hogan 360. I just did this with a client yesterday. Last week, we did the Hogan personality. Then we sat down, a scientific engineer, as it so happens, and we said, look, we generated these hypotheses last week in terms of what people might see. Let's look at the 360. Then we got into the data together and we were able to find that some of those things filtered through and some of those things didn't. So at the end of that, we said, well, actually, we're going to base the development plan on the 360 data because that's what people are seeing. Maybe there's still elements of the personality that can inform that, like how I manage stress if I'm high on a neuroticism scale, for instance. But then after we've collected all that data and we understand, I guess, where we are currently, we then talk about, well, where do we want to go? That might be the third session. What sort of leader do I want to be? What does that gap look like between the psychometrics, the 360, and my ideal leadership state? And then we start building a plan. And what we like to do, I don't know if you're the same, Yanni, is send our clients out into the real world to experiment between sessions, say 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 and 4 and 5. Come back with feedback in terms of some of those small trials, what's worked, what hasn't. So I think in terms of best practice, at the end of 6 sessions, we not only have really understood key drivers, temperamental preferences in behavior and how other people see us, but we've come up with a fairly bulletproof and road-tested development plan that should be sustainable moving forward. We don't always get to do that. Sometimes our clients are cost prohibitive. We would say, it may be at least minimum of 4 sessions if we were going to use the 2 psychometrics. And if I was really pressed and we did have a client who said, I can only give you 3 sessions, Sean, what would you recommend? We actually went with the 360. To start that one session, really hit the road running and make the most out of those 2 final sessions. But I'm not sure if that aligns with your thoughts, Yanni.
No, absolutely. I agree with you that sometimes budget is a constraint, but I think talking to behavior change and actual to look at results, I agree. I think if one could work with a 6 session, it would be amazing with the 4 as being a minimum. But it's not only assess feedback and then hands off, which I think
Yeah.
sometimes happen, which isn't. I mean, isn't ideal, but it's sometimes also due to the client restraints, that there's But Sean, two other questions that I have. One question asked by Peter Beard was, when would you say you would not use a 360? Have you had client requests for 360s and then due to either current context or situation that it's actually not ideal to go ahead with a 360 at that point in time?
That's a really good question. And I'll give two examples. I mean, organizationally, sometimes Liren and I might meet with clients and we get introduced to the idea of a particularly toxic and political organization where feedback has been weaponized in the past. That's not to say 360 couldn't be introduced, but I would be suggesting more exploration of that culture and a lot of internal communications before giving people a loaded gun necessarily, because that wouldn't be particularly useful. And at an individual level, I can think of an instance where one of my BD colleagues approached me a few weeks ago and said that a client had said, we want this person to undergo a 360 because we really want them to get feedback around A, B, and C because complaints have been made. And I sort of went back and said, well, no, you've got the data you need now. You know, complaints have been made. This is official. You shouldn't be outsourcing this conversation. You know, this now becomes an internal conversation. And once again, as our data showed, the benchmarking, generally speaking, people don't like difficult conversations. So using a 360 as a crutch to avoid maybe holding people accountable as a leader, I would say that's a misuse of the tool. And we did push back and recommend that they kind of just stood up and dealt with that one themselves. And they took our advice.
But I absolutely agree with that as well. And I do think that we often in South Africa still see and I said it in the chat earlier, after COVID, we've definitely seen a massive uptake or interest in 360s. And we do sometimes still have clients thinking of a 360 as not necessarily development, but as something that they want to, more performance management, more, I want to show you that you're not doing what you need to do, especially if
Yes.
they've already got the data, if they're already struggling, they know what it is that they're struggling with, to use the 360 just as a support or a stick to hit somebody. It doesn't necessarily, if they have the data, use the data that you have instead of trying to put it on a 360 as well. Two other questions that I recently had with a client, a conversation that we had with a client is around identifying raters. What's best practice according to you? Should somebody know or identify their own raters? If they've not identified their own raters and raters were identified for them, should they know who is rating them? Just your thoughts.
Mm. No, excellent question. This one comes up a lot, and we have clients with very different views on this. Some HR clients want to control all of the radar selections because they fear people will just stack it full of their friends. But then you sit down with the individuals and they say exactly what you just hinted at, Yanni. I don't know who these people are. You know, my peers, I never speak to them. Why would I take this feedback? On the other end, sometimes the ratings are done completely by the individual themselves, and they can either just sort of choose their friends or maybe not think more holistically. We think best practice is a coordinated approach where, say, Liron would suggest who he thinks the best raters are, and then someone from HR or maybe the manager combs that over and suggests one or two additions or maybe some omissions there. So we think that probably gets the best result, that combined approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how often do you administer a 360 in a client organization in a recurring process, so where you actually walk with them from a relationship perspective? Do you do it annually or biannually, or what would you recommend?
We certainly have some clients that part of their process is annual 360s. I sat down with some just this year and I wasn't aware that these were all Hogan veterans. I sat down with my typical pitch and they said, oh yeah, I can tell you my scores for the last 5 years. And they really knew what they were looking for because they knew what they'd been working on. And they were like, Sean, my score stayed the same, but I'm really happy because my relationship management went up because that's the thing I've been focused on. So we think that can be great. Again, whether organizations are willing to invest in that is another thing. You know, maybe 2 years could be a good one, particularly if someone's going through a real development process as a leader. We talked about before, it might take 6 months for new behaviors to start taking hold. So then asking people within another 6 months what they think, maybe the change might not have impacted. There could still be a residual effect in terms of reputation potentially there. So 2 years might get rid of some of those residual sort of legacy effects potentially. But yeah, we certainly have some clients. It's just built into their annual performance planning process now. They do that. They sit down with HR. They map out their performance plan on the year just based on the 360s.
And then my last question, and I don't see any other additional questions, but if there are anything that you think of afterwards, please pop that into an email and we can either answer it ourselves or send it through to you, Sean, as well. I'm sure that you'll be able to answer. But my last question is related to the benchmarks that's being used. You mentioned that there's what, about 40,000 leaders that's in this population group. Am I correct? I
Yeah, I
can't
think I've
recall.
underestimated that a bit. Leron can probably correct me, but we're 42,000 or something and counting.
And my question would be is do you have and I just don't have I can't remember the detail myself, but do you have specific organizational levels? So if you, for example, work with executives, that you actually use a benchmark that is not necessarily a global or leadership benchmark, but a more specific benchmark for the different organizational levels?
Yeah, yeah. We have a bunch of demographic questions right up front, so our research team can split things out by job level, by industry type, by
Uh,
obviously country there as well, and we can even combine them. We've got one client we've been agonising over benchmarks for about 6 months. They feel they're a very unique, half government, not really government organisation. So we've combined a bit of that level benchmark with a little bit of this one as well, just so they feel it's as relevant as possible for them.
Because that is for me one thing that really differentiates this assessment from others as well, is the fact that you are able to create that context and that comparison in terms of what is being seen. How do you compare as a leader? Because often that is what's missing if you make use of just typical data points with survey being sent out. And that individual gets a 6 out of 10 for something. I recently had an example with my husband going through a similar process and him being certain scores, but he's got no idea how that stacks up. How does it compare? Where does it fit into the bigger picture? Is it good or is it bad? How does it how do you interpret it? I think what makes it
Yeah.
really difficult.
And you have some leaders sometimes, Yanni, like say someone from the public sector will
Mhm.
start by saying, oh, this 360 is going to be all corporate. Leadership in the public sector looks very different than corporate. Well, you develop that benchmark for them. And sure enough, we do see differences, right? Leaders in public sector score higher on integrity items, but they score lower on accountability items. I don't know if you've seen that pattern in public servants, generally speaking, but at least then that public servant leader has all of his items against or her items against relevant benchmarks for leaders in that same industry with those same challenges, maybe around unionisation and things like
Mhm.
that. It gives the tool more credibility, and they can then say, compared to New South Wales government leaders, here's where I'm sitting.
Absolutely. I missed a question from a client who now Andrea sent it through to me, but she was asking the integrity and the selection of the respondents. Have you found challenges in the selection of the respondents, especially when the leader in question does not seem to understand the power of the tool and selects people who will sound their praise? And I think we touched on that question as well in an earlier question that was asked. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sean.
All I would add to that is I think it's a legitimate question, and I think there could be behaviours like that. But it comes down to and we said this in terms of best practice, how the program is introduced and communicated within the business. I did a briefing session for a large organisation last week where we talked about raters, and I said, please, try and find a representative group of people who know you really well and not just your friends. And guess what? Because your report results are confidential, there's no penalty if you do get some of those lower scores. Only you and your coach are going to see it anyway. But if we don't assure people of that sort of thing and people suspect that there's a performance management angle, then you could get people sort of top loading their raters in the way that your clients described.
Absolutely. Sean, that brings us 1 minute past 10. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I think listening to you, really being an expert in the use of personality together with 360 results, I think there's nobody better to ask and to discuss and to take us through these case studies. I do think that we might invite you for another one, but we will discuss this with you going forward. Thank you for everybody attending. We'll be sending through all the information, the CPD quiz, everything else as well by tomorrow morning. And if you've got any questions, please reach out to us. Thank you, Liron, for organizing. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Yanni. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye.